Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope all of you are in a good condition. So, in this time, I want to read about psychoanalysis. The first is Freudian psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud explained human behavior in terms of the interaction of the various components of personality. Freud divided human personality into three significant components: the id, ego, and superego. The ID acts according to the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification of its needs regardless of external environment. The ego then must emerge in order to realistically meet the wishes and demands of the ID in accordance with the outside world, adhering to the relative principle. Finally, the superego or conscience inculcates moral judgment and societal rules upon the ego, thus forcing the demands of the ID to be met not only realistically but morally. The superego is the last function of the personality to develop and is the embodiment of parental or social ideals established during childhood. According to Freud, personality is based on the dynamic interaction of these three components. It is with the dissolution of the Oedipus complex that the superego emerges. The superego begins as the internalization or introduction of the authority of the child's parents, especially of the father. The first authority is then overlaid with other voices of authority, producing what we think of as conscience. Although the superego is in many ways the voice of culture, it remains in alliance with the ID. There are two particular things to note about Freud's model of the psyche. First, we are born with an ID, while the ego develops through contact with culture, which in turn produces the superego. In other words, our nature is governed, or sometimes successfully, sometimes not, by culture. What is called human nature is not something essentially natural but the governance of our nature by culture. This means that human nature is not something innate and unchangeable. It is something at least in part introduced from outside. Moreover, given that culture is always historical and variable, it is itself always open to change. Second, and perhaps much more fundamental to psychoanalysis, the psyche is envisaged as a site of perpetual conflict. The most fundamental conflict is between the ID and the ego. The ID wants desires satisfied regardless of the claims of culture, while the ego, sometimes in loose alliance with the superego, is obligated to meet the claims and conventions of society. As Freud claims, the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to the unconscious. Sleep is threatened from the three directions: external stimulus, recent events, and repressed instinctual impulses which are on the watch for an opportunity of finding expression. Dreams, according to Freud, are always a compromise structure, that is, a compromise between wishes emanating from the ID and censorship enacted by the ego. If the meaning of our dreams usually remains obscure to us, it is because they contain wishes of which we are ashamed. These we must conceal from ourselves, and they have consequently been repressed, pushed into the unconscious. Dreams move between two levels: the latent dream, doubts unconscious, and the manifest content, what the dreamer remembers dreaming. Dream analysis attempts to decode the manifest content in order to discover the real meaning of the dream. The manifest content is always smaller than the latent content. This is the result of condensation, which can work in three different ways. The first, latent elements are omitted. The second, only part of a latent element arrives in the manifest content. And the last, latent elements which have something in common are condensed into a composite structures. Latent elements also appear in the manifest content via a chain of association or allusion. Freud calls displacement. This process works in two ways. In the first, a latent element is replaced not by a component part of itself but by something more remote, that is, by an illusion. And in the second, the cycle accent is shifted from an important element onto another which is unimportant, so that the dream appears differently centered and strength. The second mechanism of displacement changes the focus of the dream. What appears in the manifest content is differently centered from the dream, thus its content has different elements as its central point. Then the third aspect of the dream work, operative in the first two, is symbolization. Symbolization transforms the latent dream dogs which are expressed in words into sensory image, mostly a visual sort. The DreamWorks' final process is secondary revision. This is the narrative placed by the dreamer on the dream symbolism. It takes two forms. First, it is the verbal account of the dream, the translation of symbols into language and narrative. We fill in gaps and introduce connection, and in doing so are often guilty of gross misunderstandings. Second, and more importantly, secondary revision is the final policing and channeling strategy of the ego, making meaning and coherence in an act of unconscious censorship. There are at least two ways in which Freudian psychoanalysis can be used as a method to analyze text. The first approach is outer-centered, treating the text as the equivalent to an outer stream. The surface of a text, words and image, etc., is regarded as the manifest content, while the latent content is the outer's hidden desires. The second approach is reader-centered and derives from the secondary aspect of the outer-centered approach. This is concerned with how texts allow readers to symbolically play out desires and fantasies in the text they read. The Marxist approach to culture insists that texts and practices must be analyzed in relation to their historical condition of production, and in some versions, the changing condition of their consumption and reception. The classical Marxist approach to popular culture insists that to understand and explain a text or practice, it must always be situated in its historical moment of production, analyzed in terms of the historical condition that produced it. So it can be concluded that the similarity between the two is that they both state that to analyze a text, the text must be centered on the author or creator, while the difference is analyzing the text places more emphasis on the reader and the writer. Meanwhile, Marxism emphasizes the historical condition of the text. The second is Lasanian psychoanalysis. Jacques Lassan rereads Freud using the theoretical methodology developed by structuralism. He seeks to anchor psychoanalysis firmly in culture rather than biology. According to Jacques Lassan, we are going into a condition of plague and subsequently spend the rest of our lives trying to overcome this condition. Plague is experienced in different ways and as different things, but it is always a non-representable expression of the fundamental condition of being human. The result is an endless quest in search of an imagined moment of plenitude. Lassan argues that we make a journey through three determining stages of development. The first is the mirror stage, the second is the Verda game, and the third is the Oedipus complex. According to Lassan, the mirror stage is a drama whose internal truth is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation and which manufactures for the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification. The succession of fantasies that extends from a fragmented body image to a form of its totality. The mirror stage heralds the moment of entry into an order of subjectivity Lassan calls the imaginary. The imaginary for Lassan is precisely this realm of image in which we make identifications, but in the very act of doing so we are led to misperceive and misrecognize ourselves. The second stage of development is the vertigen. Originally named by Fruit after watching his grandson throw a cotton reel away, or gun, and then pull it back again by means of an attached thread, or here. Lasan rereads this as representation of the child beginning to enter the symbolic, and in particular, its introduction into language. The moment when desire becomes human is also that in which the child is born into language. Like the further game, language is presence made of absence. Once we enter language, the completeness of the real is gone forever. The third stage of development is the Oedipus complex, the encounter with sexual difference. Successful completion of the Oedipus complex enforces our transition from the imaginary to the symbolic. The third is child psychoanalysis. Laura Mulvey's 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema is perhaps the classic statement on popular film from the perspective of feminist psychoanalysis. The essay is concerned with how popular cinema produced and reproduced what she calls the male gaze. Mulvey describes her approach as political psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic theory is appropriated as a political weapon to demonstrate the way the unconscious of patriarchal society has structured film form. The inscription of the image of woman in this system is twofold. The first, she is the object of male desire, and the second, she is the signifier of the threat of castration. In order to challenge popular cinema's manipulation of visual pleasure, Mulvey calls for what she describes as the destruction of pleasure as a radical weapon. She identifies pleasure that must be destroyed. First, there is scopophilia, the pleasure of looking. Citing Freud, she suggests that it is always more than just the pleasure of looking. Scopophilia involves taking other people as objects, subjecting them to controlling gaze. Popular cinema promotes and satisfies a second feature, developing scopophilia and its narcissistic aspect. Here, Mulvey draws on Lassan's 2009 account of the mirror stage to suggest that there is an analogy to be made between the constitution of a child's ego and the pleasures of cinematic identification. Just a child recognizes and misrecognizes itself in the mirror. The spectator recognizes and misrecognizes itself on the screen. Her argument is that popular cinema produced two contradictory forms of visual pleasure. The first invites scopophilia, the second promotes narcissism. Popular cinema is structured around two moments, moments of narrative and moments of spectacle. The first is associated with the active male, the second with the passive male. Mulvey concludes her argument by suggesting that the pleasure of popular cinema must be destroyed in order to liberate women from the exploitation and oppression of being the passive raw material of the active male gaze. And the last is Slavoj Zizek and Lacanian fantasy. Terry Eggleton describes the Slovenian critic Slavoj Zizek as the most formidably brilliant exponent of psychoanalysis, indeed of cultural theory in general, to have emerged in Europe for some decades. The three main influences on Zizek's work are the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the politics of Marx, and the psychoanalysis of Lassan. It is, however, the influence of Lassan that organizes the place of Marx and Hegel in his work. Fantasy is not the same as illusion. Rather, fantasy organizes how we see and understand reality. It works as a frame through which we see and make sense of the world. Our fantasies are what makes us unique. They provide us with our point of view, organizing how we see and experience the world around us. Zizek provides other examples from popular culture of the fantasy construction of reality. Rather than fulfilling desire, fantasy is the staging of desire. As he explains, what the fantasy stage is not a scene in which our desire is fulfilled, fully satisfied, but on the contrary, a scene that releases stage the desire as such. The fundamental point of psychoanalysis is that desire is not something given in advance, something that has to be constructed, and it's precisely the role of fantasy to give the coordinates of the subject's desire, to specify its object, to locate the position the subject assumes in it. In this way, then, fantasy stage functions as an empty surface, a kind of screen for the projection of desires. Desire is never fulfilled or fully satisfied. It is endlessly reproduced in our fantasies. Anxiety is brought on by the disappearance of desire. In other words, anxiety is the result of getting too close to what we desire, thus threatening to eliminate lack itself and end desire. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time and nice attention. I apologize if there are many mistakes. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.